Good day, everyone. So, for this next lecture, it's divided into two. The first half is about profiling, economic credentialing, as well as risk management, while the other half is on benchmarking.
Medicine has historically operated as an activity built on strong interpersonal relationships founded on trust. The physician patient relationship and the assumption of trust have been diminished because of rapid changes in society, including increasing mobility of patients and the emergence of healthcare as an industry. These changes have fractured long term care relationships and stimulated the discussion of whether the patients and society are receiving value for their money. Expanding information resources amplify the effect of isolated healthcare facilities and often lead to unwarranted and uninformed conclusions about the effectiveness of the overall system. Because of that, there is a need to learn about the following topics: physician profiling, academic detailing, economic credentialing, risk adjustment, and the Medicare MSDRG system, as well as the factors other than treatment that affect health outcomes. The New York Cabbage study was one of the first instances in which public reporting was performed. In 1989, the state of New York began collecting, analyzing, and reporting mortality rates for coronary artery bypass graft surgery, also known as CABG, marking a pivotal moment in healthcare transparency. And take note that this is an public endeavor. It's the state of New York. So the goal here was to empower patients to make better choices and encourage providers to improve outcomes. So the challenge was that providers with higher mortality rates argued that their patients were sicker, making raw comparisons unfair. So the goal of this was essentially to help patients choose which providers they would go to. However, of course, doctors challenged it. Why are they going to be punished for their high mortality rates when in fact their patients in the first place were already sicker? So the solution was to make a risk adjustment model. Later, we're going to learn what risk adjustment is. So they incorporated 42 preoperative risk factors to calculate a predicted mortality rate. So in other words, they standardized it. So the impact was that the public reports compared hospitals' actual outcomes against their expected risk-adjusted performance rather than simple rankings. What are the results of this endeavor? The volume increased by 30.6%. In other words, more people, more patients were willing to undergo this procedure. Also, the expected mortality rate, which is a measure of patient sickness, increased by 36.3%. So, those patients who have worse conditions were more confident to undergo the procedure. And despite the sicker patients, the actual mortality rates fell. In other words, the outcomes improved. Maybe because of the initiative as well of the doctors who were doing this procedure. The risk adjustment mortality rate actually fell by a remarkable 41.2%. So, because of this drive for transparency, it led to widespread improvements. 27 out of 30 hospitals achieved lower risk adjusted mortality rates. How did they do that? The hospitals actually altered their processes to improve patient stability before surgery. In other words, they made sure that the patients were already more stable before undergoing the procedure to improve their likelihood of better outcomes. High-risk patients were referred to physicians with superior outcomes. In other words, good doctors were matched to those more difficult patients. And actually, some programs replaced chiefs of service and reorganized. So because of transparency, they were able to improve their health system. Of course, this met physician resistance. There was fierce resistance to releasing individual physician data because it became like a point of comparison. Also, there were also concerns about data accuracy and the validity of risk adjustment. There was an aversion to increased accountability and reduced professional authority because these were back in the days during which doctors were seen as very high, and then there was a sort of paternalistic attitude in which they are to be trusted wholly by the patients. Also, there were fears of physicians gaming the system by refusing high-risk patients because it's going to place their metrics at risk. From the Cabbage study, public reporting was improved later on. So, for example, let's look at the case of physician profiling and report cards. So, it emerged with managed care in the 1990s. So, report cards involve third-party payers comparing medical service use among their subscribers and reporting performance back to doctors. So, the goals here are to assist patients with provider selection, to increase access of information, Reduce practice variation by identifying and sharing performance outliers, reduce unnecessary resource usage and overall costs, and to replace intrusive case-by-case utilization reviews with an aggregated measure of performance. So, how do you develop a practice profile? We're going to learn the steps in the next slide. There are 4 steps in developing a practice profile. First, you select measures and establish performance thresholds for process outcomes and resource use. Next, you collect data from various sources like billing systems, medical records, or patient reporting. Third, you analyze data, adjust for risk, and identify outliers to ensure fair comparison. And lastly, you communicate findings clearly and concisely, often in a one-page report to avoid information overload. But the question is, does profiling even work? Actually, the evidence there is mixed. There is some evidence for positive effect. For example, some studies have documented that profiling led to significant reductions in hospital length of stay. Another study also found that physicians' negative views of profiling decreased after they had been profiled. In other words, it's not as bad as it first sounds to be profiled. And lastly, profiling may help reduce inappropriately high utilization while increasing care to underserved patients. However, research have not found any effect of profiling on pharmaceutical prescribing patterns. Also, one meta-analysis concluded that the benefits of profiling were unlikely to exceed its costs. In other words, it's more expensive to do profiling than to have any benefit from it. Also, after risk adjusting, physician practice may account for only a small percentage of the variance in medical care. So, of course, if you're a physician, you're going to have some concerns regarding these profiles. First, of course, the source of data and the accuracy. There is also generally a lack of baseline data. In other words, your physician profile is going to be a snapshot just for that particular period of time. Also, there may not be any correction for patient non-compliance. You're going to be blamed even if the patient did not follow your plan for them, right? There may also be inadequate risk adjustment leading to some bias. Because of this, there are also unintended consequences. In order for physicians to avoid a bad profile, they may be tempted to game the system, so to speak. In other words, they could refuse to treat high-risk patients, or they may overstate the disease severity, so that when the patient improved, it would reflect good on their metrics. So the real-world impact of this is that there is limited public availability of physician reports, and reports from health plans are often less credible. Also, there is low patient awareness and use of performance data. As an alternative to profiling, we could also do academic detailing. Academic detailing is a more focused approach that concentrates on specific medical intervention. It takes in the form of one-on-one educational outreach with the express purpose of changing a provider's behavior. So you could have various goals. For example, you could try to increase the usage of a beneficial intervention. You could encourage people to undergo cancer screening. You could also reduce the use of specific service. For example, you could try to avoid overprescription of broad-spectrum antibiotics. And lastly, you could use it to encourage a switch to a more effective or a more cost-effective drug or procedure. You could very well imagine a dark side to this profiling business, right? Because if you use economic credentials like economic data and efficiency criteria to appoint your medical staff, then it's going to lead to certain problems. Of course, from the perspective of the hospital, they're just doing it in order to make or to ensure that their hospital is being profitable. However, from the perspective of a physician, of course, they're going to oppose it, or we're going to oppose it, because we don't want to use economic criteria that's unrelated to quality of care or professional competency. Sometimes bad things happen, and it's entirely unrelated um to your professional skill, right? Also, you want to not lose control of the hospital to managers and plain bureaucrats who do not know anything about medical care. And lastly, it of course is going to threaten the physician's ability to earn a living. For example, you could imagine or consider a doctor who has a negative profile because it just so happened that they're always receiving high-risk patients. And it just so happened that even if they provided the best care, something bad happened and the patients died. It's going to mark them. Profiling is going to mark them as poor doctors, right? So again, I emphasize the importance of risk adjustment. We need to account for differences in patient populations that exist prior to treatment and therefore could affect outcomes. This is crucial for making fair and valid comparisons between providers and treatments. The next slide, I'm going to discuss to you um, a prime example of risk adjustment. The Medicare Severity Diagnosis Related Group or MSDRG system is a prime example of risk adjustment. So it's used for payment, for reimbursing doctors from health insurance, right? So so there's a certain hierarchy for DRG assignment. So patients are grouped into major diagnostic categories. So the care is first divided by body system. Next is divided between medical and surgical. So it recognizes that surgery is, of course, more resource intensive and therefore more expensive than medical care. It's further divided into the specific services and further into complications and comorbidities. So it's divided to those with major comorbidities or MCC, with comorbidities, and those without comorbidities. When measuring health outcomes, you need to consider these three major inputs: clinical patient input, meaning patient factors, non-clinical patient inputs, as well as treatment and random events. For clinical patient inputs, you need to consider demographics such as age, gender, and race, the principal diagnosis and severity, the comorbidities, the acute clinical stability, as well as the physical functional status. For non-clinical patient inputs, that's where health-related quality of life comes in, socioeconomic status, cognitive and psychological function, as well as attitudes and preferences. And lastly, for treatment and random events, that's where choice of treatment comes in, effectiveness of delivery, as well as random chance, such as the rare allergic reaction or any unexpected recovery. As for the Medicare MSDRG system, which is mostly used for the purpose of insurance, there are also other risk adjustment systems. And these ones are more for prognostication. For example, the Apache 2 and the Charlton Index. The Apache 2 is designed for ICU patients, meaning those with severe conditions admitted to the intensive care unit. It calculates an acute physiology score, or APS, which could have a value from around 0 to 71. The basis for this is on 12 routine physiological values, age as well as health status. So if you have a higher score for this, then it means that you have a higher risk for mortality. So severity is measured based on how far the patient's vital signs are from normal. In contrast, the Charlson Index is used more for general medical patients. It's based on 19 predefined comorbid conditions that have a weight, either 1, 2, 3, or 6. So, for example, 6 are those that are most severe, those that have the most impact to your 1 year mortality. Example, AIDS or a solid tumor. Well, 1 is, for example, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD. The sum of the weights creates a comorbidity index that is easy to use with administrative data. So we're done with physician profiling. Greater oversight and accountability is needed, not just in politics, but in healthcare as well. So for comparisons across providers to be fair, there has to be risk adjustment. We discussed three types of risk adjustment earlier, right? Three different examples. Physician profiling, academic detailing, and economic credentialing are powerful tools, but they have methodological challenges. We don't want them to be unfair to our physicians and hospitals. So to overcome resistance and reap benefits, we must use these tools with care, ensuring that the comparisons are all appropriate and risk adjusted. After all, our ultimate goal is to reduce unwanted variation and to improve healthcare for all. So we're done with physician profiling. Let's move now to benchmarking. In benchmarking, you simply compare your performance to a certain benchmark. So comparison itself is going to improve quality. So consider this. Imagine a swimmer who only realizes his technique is flawed when he sees others. Just like that, just like a swimmer or an athlete or any other performance-based measure, organizations often need external reference points in order to realize that they have actually an opportunity for improvement. They'd like you to remember these three truths for quality improvement. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. That's where measurement comes in terms of management. Second, without a standard, it is impossible to determine how much improvement is actually needed. And lastly, improvement is often easiest when you are furthest from the target. In other words, it's easier to capture the low-hanging fruit. Focus first on what you could do before what you could easily do before you aim for those large, big targets. Here we have the definition of benchmarking. It is simply the process of comparing an organization's processes and outcomes against those of other organizations. Overall, the goal is to uncover, adopt, and implement best practices to achieve superior performance. When you say that something is a best practice, it is the method or technique that has consistently shown results superior to those achieved with other means. There are four types of benchmark. It could be internal, industry, competitive, or functional. When you say that it's an internal benchmark, you compare performance across units of a single organization. For example, the medical ward versus surgical ward. It's the easiest and fastest to undertake. Next, you could have industry benchmarking. Here you compare organizational performance to the industry average or the top performers in the field. So for example, if you're managing a hospital, you could compare the organizational performance to the average performance of other hospitals in your area. Or if you're a third or a tertiary level hospital, could compare your performance to the average performance of tertiary level hospitals. Next would be competitive benchmarking. Here you compare performance against other organizations vying for the same customers. However, the data of course can be difficult to obtain because the data belongs to your competitors. So for example, if you're in a hospital in Subic, you look for other hospitals in Subic that are targeting the same population. For example, you're a private hospital in Subic. Then you look at other hospitals, private hospitals in your area. But I assume you could imagine the difficulty is that especially in the private sector, the data tends to be um, private as well or hidden from the public scrutiny. Lastly, you could have functional benchmarking. Here you compare your process against a recognized leader, even if they are outside your industry. So if you're particularly ambitious, for example, you could compare it to something that is recognized to be the best in that field. For example, you want to learn about logistics. Even if you're a hospital, then you could compare logistics to something like FedEx, right? Okay. In the next slide, we're going to look at the four steps of the process. So here are the four steps of the benchmarking process. First, you choose what to benchmark. Of course, there are many metrics out there, and not all of them are worth benchmarking. You choose those that are able to make a difference to to your final client. In the case of hospitals, patients. Next, you set performance targets. Find the benchmark organization and establish a goal. So I have mentioned earlier the different types of benchmarks. So you could look at the industry average, for example. So you determine how to achieve targets. You learn from the benchmark organizations' methods. How have they been able to improve so that they have reached that target performance? And lastly, organize and motivate. Reorganize resources, motivate staff, and monitor progress to achieve or even exceed the targets. So, what are some potential obstacles to benchmarking? First, you could have an illusion of uniqueness. So, it's this mindset of it's not invented here syndrome. So, you think that your process is too different to learn from others. But actually, no hospital and no organization is that different from another, such that you cannot improve by looking at other organizations. Next, we would also have poorly defined objectives. So, a vague goal is something like improve quality without actually specifying any metric, which would tell you that you have actually improved in terms of quality. Third is a lack of employee buy in. Some staff could just see it as more paperwork if they do not realize that there is actually a need for quality improvement. Next would be insufficient top management support. If the leaders aren't committed, then no one else will be. Second to the last, unrealistic targets or timetables. You need to set goals that are possible, but remaining challenging enough. And lastly, a lack of data or resources. It's also possible to become data rich but information poor if your systems are incompatible. For example, if you have a lot of data on a certain metric, but that metric is not matched to your target goals, and you could be information poor in that sense. So you could have a balanced scorecard, as previously described by Kaplan and Norton. So what are balanced scorecards? These are simply tools developed to communicate an organization's strategic goals and define a plan for reaching them. So this framework links day-to-day work with overall company strategy through four key perspectives. And these four key perspectives are shown in this pyramid. Uppermost is financial, followed by customer, internal, and deepest is learning and growth. So let's look in turn specifically into these four aspects or four perspectives. The uppermost and most superficial, because of course in a capitalist society like in the United States, which is very similar to our case here in the Philippines, is the financial perspective. So how do we look to stakeholders? Is this measure going to improve revenue growth? Is it going to contribute to cost reduction as well as profitability? The next layer is customer. How do customers see us? So factors there include patient satisfaction and loyalty. We want, of course, our customers to keep coming back to our hospital. Third is the internal business process. What must we excel at? Um, so here the measures could focus on innovation, operational efficiency, as well as customer management. But the deepest and, in my opinion, the most important is learning and growth. How can you continue to improve? Are we improving in terms of employee skills, technology, and corporate culture? While the balanced scorecard is going to give you the overall overview of the process, how all the efforts contribute towards the different goals, the four different perspectives I have mentioned earlier, you also have dashboards. And these dashboards give an operational view. So there are two types of dashboards, reporting dashboards as well as management dashboards. Reporting dashboards are shown to all your employees. So it shows aggregate data. It could be daily, weekly, or it could even be a monthly summary. So it's often in the form of static reports. And the goal there is to influence future behavior. So for example, you could use it to show that the organization is continuously improving. In contrast, a management dashboard needs to be real time or near real time as possible. Here, the goal is to influence current activity. So it's like a car warning light, or it's like statistical process control. It aims to give you real time information on what's happening on the ground for the management to be able to act correspondingly. To make it concrete, to help you imagine it further, let's imagine the case of an operating room. How do you make a dashboard for an operating room? Well, it's very simple. Could be in the form of this table, in which you list the metric, the specific target, and the performance. And lastly, of course, you note the status. You could use color coding to highlight the areas requiring attention. So, for example, red if the performance is not reaching your target, or even if it's worsening. Green if it's achieved. Right? So during implementation, you have three phases. First, the planning phase to understand the issue, assemble the team, research the initiative, and create the plan with clear responsibilities for accountability as well as a reasonable timeline. Reasonable meaning it's possible but still achievable and challenging. Next would be the execution phase. In the execution phase, you establish a baseline, initiate changes, train employees, provide support, and give rapid feedback. And lastly is the post-execution control. This involves continuous reporting and enforcing changes to ensure that the process becomes the permanent standard. So to make sure that the changes are lasting for your organization. Of course, we're going to encounter some resistance to change, but how are we going to overcome them? So you could leverage the following things: political desirability, political visibility, as well as credibility. Political desirability refers to the compelling reason or crisis for having change. Second is political visibility. Do you have support from key stakeholders, from the top management, as well as top influencers? Next would be credibility. Does your management have the credibility? Meaning do they follow through? Do they have a track record of following through changes that they want to implement? Okay. So, what are some of the methods that you could do to induce change? You could have improved communication and education. In doing so, you also always need to remember that you need to have short and clear summaries. You need to engage respected peers, the so-called champions, to support your cause. Also, you need to hold one-on-one sessions as well and provide concurrent feedback on results. You would also place incentives. So incentives doesn't necessarily mean monetary. They could be non-monetary as well, such as recognition or leadership opportunities. Okay. In order to have lasting change, all three elements of organizational architecture, such as education, reward systems, as well as decision making, have to be aligned and mutually reinforcing. If any one of these is missing or misaligned, the system will become undermined. In conclusion, benchmarking is essential for self assessment and identifying industry Best practices. The tools that we have identified include balanced scorecards, which are for long-term strategy, while dashboards are for operational focus. Successful implementation depends on planning, execution, and control, with a strong emphasis on overcoming resistance. To make the changes stick, organization must have an architecture where decision rights, rewards, and performance evaluation are properly structured and aligned. Thank you very much, everyone. If you have any questions, just contact me.